Hegel and Heyrick. On the 18th of October, 1831, less than a month before the death of Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel on the 14th of November, 1831, Elizabeth Heyrick died. Born on the 4th of December, 1769, less than a year before the birth of Hegel on 27th of August, 1770, Heyrick was Hegel's contemporary. And yet, to misquote Susan Buck-Morse, there is no place in the university in which the particular research constellation Hegel and Heyrick would have a home. What might a home for Hegel and Heyrick look like? Well, at this workshop on Hegel, slavery, and abolition, we think, who Hegel was, but who on earth was Heyrick? During the decade following the dual deaths of Hegel and Heyrick, the decade of the 1830s, a decade described by historian of Britain Alexander Llewellyn as the decade of reform, and a decade described by historian of the Caribbean Philip D. Curtin as the Jamaican Revolution. The stimulus to abolish slavery in the British Empire was consistently attributed by those apparently at the heart of the British abolitionist movement to Heyrick. Take, for example, a British assessment in 1834, Anglo-American assessments in 1836 to 8, and the assessment of Anglo-Americans in conversation with Britons in 1840 to 41. In the wake of what is commonly understood as Britain's act to abolish slavery, but which was actually Britain's act to compensate enslavers, while at the same time shifting society from a reliance upon slavery to a reliance upon something called apprenticeship, George Stephen, the lawyer of the Men's Anti-Slavery Society, headquartered in London, wrote to Anne Knight, a British woman lecturing in France about anti-slavery, that there is no doubt that apprenticeship is slavery in another form, and argued that Miss Herrick's celebrated pamphlet, Immediate Not Gradual Emancipation, is still better qualified for the foreign task and more intelligible to strangers than any other text available at that time as a source of all the arguments against apprenticeship and in favor of immediate abolition. At what is conventionally taken to have been the beginning of the British campaign to abolish apprenticeship, in September 1836, the Anglo-American abolitionist Angelina Grimke, in her appeal to the Christian women of the South, asked rhetorically, "What have women done for the great and glorious cause of emancipation? Who wrote that pamphlet?" Which moved the heart of Wilberforce to pray over the wrongs and his tongue to plead the cause of the oppressed Africans? It was a woman, Elizabeth Heyrick. And at what is conventionally taken to have been the end of the British campaign to abolish apprenticeship, in August-September 1838, a similar rhetorical question, namely, has not the one idea that rose silently in Elizabeth Heyrick's mind spread until it has almost become the world's idea? Was posed by Lydia Maria Child, a member of the American Anti-Slavery Society. In the same month, this society's president, William Lloyd Garrison, declared that we should let it never be forgotten in the history of human liberty that the doctrine which has annihilated the slave system in the West Indies and will subvert it in America the only doctrine that has the power to stop the slave trade, to extirpate slavery universally without the shedding of blood, to rescue and redeem benighted suffering Africa, the doctrine of immediate emancipation, was first promulgated in Great Britain by a woman, Elizabeth Heyrick. Lastly, in the wake of the colonial Caribbean abolitions of apprenticeship in 1840, another member of the American Anti-Slavery Society, Lucretia Mott, making the case that she, a woman, should be admitted to the World Anti-Slavery Convention being held in London, argued that we should not contemplate the exclusion of women, seeing as, she argued, immediate abolition is something originating with E. Heyrick, a woman. Although the British abolitionists who organized that World Anti-Slavery Convention, that is Joseph Sturge, did not agree with Mott that women should be admitted to the convention, Sturge did agree with her about the primacy of Elizabeth Heyrick. In his memoir titled A Visit to the United States in 1841, Sturge wrote that the long and heart-sickening interval that occurred between the abolition of the slave trade of Great Britain and the emancipation of her slaves was owing to the false but universal notion that the slaves must be gradually prepared for freedom, a delusion which this honored woman was the first to detect. Furthermore, when a decade later, in May 1853, Harriet Beecher Stowe visited Birmingham in the West Midlands of England, she stayed at the home of Sturge and later recalled his sustained repetition of this same attribution. He gave me, Stowe tells us in her memoir, Sunny Memories of Foreign Lands, a little account of their anti-slavery struggles in England and said, what was well worthy of note, that they made no apparent progress in affecting public opinion until they firmly advocated the right of every innocent being to immediate and complete freedom, without any conditions. He said that a woman is fairly entitled to the credit of this suggestion, Elizabeth Heyrick. For their part, in their memorial to Harriet Beecher Stowe, having already acknowledged that they owed their existence to Heyrick's spirit-stirring appeals, the Birmingham Female Society for the Relief of British Negro Slaves offered the history and objects of this association, stating for the record that in the years 1825, 6, 7, 8, we believe about 20,000 families in Birmingham were called upon in order to recommend them to carry out the principle of boycotting enslaved produced sugar. That more than 300 kindred associations were formed before the close of the first year, and that by the year 1827, 44,500 publications had been distributed. Heyrick is the one who mobilized this movement. This did not, however, meet with the approval of the up till that moment undisputed leader of the British anti-slavery movement, William Wilberforce, who lamented that for ladies to meet, to publish, to go from house to house, stirring up petitions, these appear to me to be proceedings unsuited to the female character, as delineated in scripture. Sufficiently acquainted now with Heyrick, or rather with her reputation, we might venture to locate for her and Hegel a home. On the 12th of June, 1824, in Elizabeth Heyrick's hometown of Leicester, the British local newspaper, the Leicester Chronicle, republished an extract of a pamphlet for which Heyrick was to become famous. This extract was preceded by what it claimed were some introductory observations as inserted in a respectable London paper a few days ago. That respectable London paper was the Morning Chronicle. This letter to the editor of the Morning Chronicle read as follows. Sir, I am one of those who have long felt most anxious that the tricks and impostures practiced by the colonial assemblies to hoodwink the people, to humbug the government, and to bamboozle the saints, as the friends of emancipation are scornfully termed, should be detected and exposed, that justice may have its free course and the suffering Africans obtain redress for the enormous and numerous wrongs which the Christian subjects of Europe have for so many ages been allowed to inflict upon them. Let the just claims of the planters to compensation be listened to, while their struggles for the dominion of the cartwhip ought to excite unmingled disgust and horror in every true British heart. The letter writer, having thus established where they stood on anti-slavery, went on to explain their position on Heyrick's pamphlet. The following, they said, is an extract from a spirited and well-written pamphlet just published by Hatchard, bearing the startling title of Immediate, Not Gradual Abolition, etc., but which deserves the attentive perusal of the friends of the slaves. The writer's heart is deeply interested in his subject. And whatever may be thought of his daring title, the passage of his work, which I am desirous of laying before your readers, will show that he is no wild enthusiast, but the enlightened friend of his species, desirous of banishing from the earth with all possible speed a system of tyranny, cruelty, and vice. In some respects, he may go too far. Yet many of his remarks are so masterly and well-timed that we attach importance to the general circulation of his pamphlet. Did Hegel ever have sight of this letter? There is reason to suppose that he did. The historian of Hegel, M.J. Petrie, edited some extant extracts that Hegel copied from various issues of this British newspaper, the Morning Chronicle. One such extract demonstrates that Hegel read at least that issue of the Morning Chronicle that was published on the 12th of May, 1824. Can we then be confident he will have read up to a month later an issue of the Morning Chronicle that may have carried our letter to its editor? It may be helpful for us to suppose that he did, for our doing so may better enable us to contemplate the comparison and contrast between the contemporaries Hegel and Heyrick. Although Susan Buck-Morse, author of that article, Hegel and Haiti, did indeed notice that Hegel read the British Morning Chronicle in the 1820s, she did not deem this fact worthy of further investigation. On the contrary, Buck-Morse even attempted to downplay the importance of an earlier article, Hegel et Haiti, by Pierre Franklin Tavarès, on the very grounds that Tavarès deals with the later Hegel, by which statement Buck-Morse meant, according to her initial dismissal of Tavarès, that his conjecture seems to be that Hegel's concern for abolitionism came later, in the 1820s. What Tavarès actually said was, and I translate, that not abolitionism, but rather Haiti appears very late in the evolution of Hegel. It arises at a decisive moment in his long African tour between 1822 and 1826, to be precise, during Hegel's Berlin years. Despite Buck-Morse's summary dismissal of the 1820s, critics of Hegel have reason to return to what Tavarès called a decisive moment, because if our supposition is correct, Hegel may, during it, have been a witness to the beginning of the British abolitionist campaign. Crucially, the importance to Hegel of abolitionism in the British Empire, as opposed to abolitionism in the French Empire, is that on balance, Hegel believes, as he lectured in 1824, although this may be different given what Professor Bernasconi said, that it is the English who have done the most to abolish slavery. One clause in that letter of June 1824 to the editor of the Morning Chronicle arrests me, and should, I contend, arrest you. It is the following: let the just claims of the planters to compensation be listened to. Clearly, this clause drips with sarcasm, but it also draws our attention to a certain kind of relationship those in the imperial metropole of London might possibly enjoy with folks at the colonial periphery of the Caribbean, the relationship of listening. What might it mean for someone in the metropole to listen, truly listen to someone at the periphery? One of the two persons petrified and glorified in stone outside this very building offered us in 1825 and 1826 a compelling answer. For initially in his personal narrative of travels to the equinoctial regions of the new continent, and subsequently in his political essay on the island of Cuba, Alexander von Humboldt published his chapter on slavery. What I find remarkable about this chapter is not only that Humboldt harnesses it to tell us that slavery is possibly the greatest evil to have afflicted humanity. What's remarkable is not merely that through this chapter, although its context is Cuba, Humboldt explicitly acknowledges the neighboring island of Haiti, telling us that the great revolutions that the American continent and the Antillean archipelago have seen since the beginning of the 19th century have affected ideas and public reason, even in the countries where slavery still exists, and now is beginning to change. No. The Haitian Revolution is said to have been inaugurated by the imperative statement, "Listen to the voice of liberty, which speaks in the hearts of us all." And what's remarkable is that Humboldt accords to this an attitude he himself adopts, the normative force of a duty encapsulated by Humboldt's principle that it befits the traveler who witnessed up close the torment and degradation of humanity to bring the laments of the wretched to the ears of those who have the power to assuage them. One way to endow the research constellation Hegel and Heyrick with an intellectual home is to assess each of Hegel and Heyrick according to their performance against Humboldt's principle. Like Humboldt in 1825, both Hegel and Heyrick in 1824 denounced colonial slavery. For Hegel, in his lectures on the philosophy of law, the slavery of the Negroes is a wholly unjust institution, one which contradicts true justice, both human and divine, and which is to be rejected. However, also in 1824, or more precisely during the winter semester of 1824 to 1825, only Hegel argued in his lectures that slavery is unjust in and for itself, for the essence of man is freedom, but he must first become mature before he can be free. He must first become mature before he can be free. Thus, it is more fitting and correct that slavery should be eliminated gradually than it should be done away with all at once. Heyrick disagreed, as was reported in the letter of June 1824, to the editor of the Morning Chronicle. Whereas Hegel argued that colonial slavery should be abolished gradually, Heyrick argued that it should be abolished immediately. Now, if Heyrick differed from Hegel on this point, it is because she listened in a way consistent with Humboldt's principle of listening to enslaved abolitionists in Demerara. We might reasonably ask, what can the now hackneyed discourse about Hegel and Haiti learn from a more refreshing discourse about Heyrick and Demerara? Just as Tavarès and Buck-Morse have proven via reference to his reading of the journal Minerva that Haiti was on the mind of Hegel, we have proof that Demerara was on the mind of Hegel too. This is clear, for instance, from the notes he took on the issue of the Morning Chronicle published on the 21st of April, 1826. In Demerara, Hegel wrote, it was one of the greatest objections to the missionary Smith that he had gone about asking questions with regards to the condition of the slaves. Moreover, if our supposition is correct, then Hegel would have also read about Demerara in the extract that is quoted from Heyrick's pamphlet. That extract, which comes immediately after the letter to the editor, and which appears to introduce a postscript to an earlier manuscript, begins with the following paragraph. Since the preceding pages were written, the sentences passed upon the insurgents of Demerara and Kingston have reached us. Some have been hung, others have received corporal punishment. To what extent, let those who have ears to hear and heart to feel deeply ponder. Some had received, others were yet to receive 1,000 lashes and were condemned to be worked in chains during the residue of their lives. If in this postscript to her pamphlet, Heyrick is responding to news received in Britain in January 1824 of the punishment meted out to freedom fighters in Demerara, then in the main body of her pamphlet, Heyrick is responding to news received in Britain in October 1823 of the Demerara uprising itself. That news was very clear in conveying to those in the imperial metropole what enslaved abolitionists were demanding, nay, asserting at the colonial periphery. A key primary source for this cri de coeur of the enslaved abolitionists is the testimony of the governor of the colony of Demerara, General John Murray. In a letter dated 24th of August, 1823, the colonial secretary, Lord Bathurst, to the colonial secretary, Lord Bathurst, General Murray states that a report reached me that plantation success was on fire. I pushed on, and at the bridge of plantation Le Ressouvenir passed a body of armed Negroes who disputed the passage, but perceiving that these were not above 40, I returned to ascertain their views, which they stated to be unconditional emancipation. On the 11th of October, 1823, Lord Bathurst's cabinet colleague, the Foreign Secretary George Canning, wrote to his fellow gradualist William Wilberforce that the cry was for immediate and unqualified freedom. Throughout the remainder of the month of October, and indeed for the rest of the year, this cry was reported in newspapers. A widow racialized as white in Leicester, in the East Midlands of England, heard this cry, listened to this cry, rose to the moral requirements of this cry. Her ear was ever open to the cry of distress, wrote one of Heyrick's earliest biographers in 1895, Catherine Hutton Beale. Moreover, not satisfied with passively listening to what she was told, but also desirous of probing the content of what she had been told in a second anti-slavery pamphlet she published in July 1824, a pamphlet with the long title, An Inquiry Which of the Two Parties is Best Entitled to Freedom, the Slave or the Slaveholder, from an impartial examination of the conduct of each party at the bar of public justice. Heyrick tested the contrary of this cry. The gradual abolitionists say, Heyrick reported, the West Indian Negroes are unfit to be entrusted with liberty. Even Mr. Broome says they are unfit. This, he says, at the very moment when he is bringing their fitness to the severest test, that of their conduct during the late insurrection in Demerara. Why are they unfit to be entrusted with liberty? What evidences have they given of their unfitness? For Heyrick, Demerara was proof against the need for any apprenticeship. Heyrick took it for granted that the conduct of the Demerara slaves afforded a pretty fair specimen of what may be reasonably expected from the general body of West Indian Negroes, and she embarked upon an investigation of their conduct during the late insurrection in that colony. Heyrick was particularly moved by the insurgent enslaved abolitionists' approach to making themselves heard. As Heyrick herself describes what happened, on the very day on which they struck work, a considerable body of the slaves, amounting to about 1,000, had a long conference with the governor, who happened to be riding out in the direction of the disturbed estates. To him, they came forward to represent their grievances and to solicit his interference. They are said to have expressed the loyalty to the king and their desire to act peaceably, and it does not appear that any one of those present at this conference were guilty of any violence. This reasonable and civilized parley Heyrick contrasts with West Indian justice, which she believes, in fact, consisted of cruel and unusual punishments, extrajudicial punishments, leading to extrajudicial killings, black parley, white lynchings. Furthermore, not satisfied with her own actions of listening and testing what she had been told, Heyrick criticized the correlative inaction of others. In her pamphlet, Heyrick accused the wealthy white establishment male members of the new Society for the Mitigation and Gradual Abolition of Slavery throughout the British Dominions, a society only set up in January 1823, of converting the cry for immediate into gradual emancipation, and thereby acquiescing in the slavery of our African brother. For Heyrick, the so-called Clapham saints had committed themselves to a satanic policy, revolting to the common sense of justice, and by their cowardly activism, they had betrayed an unworthy diffidence in the cause in which they have embarked. Just as Heyrick, in this way, publicly denounced Wilberforce and his so-called saints, so Heyrick would have denounced Hegel, had Hegel had the courage, that is, actually, to enter into abolitionist activism and organizing, rather than merely pleasuring himself over the pages of the journal Minerva. Proudly, Buck Morse declares that Hegel knew about real slaves revolting successfully against real masters, and he elaborated his dialectic of lordship and bondage deliberately within this contemporary context. Well, yes, Hegel knew, but did Hegel listen? What matters is not so much how Hegel elaborated on the news as whether Hegel engaged with what the news conveyed. Hegel didn't. Heyrick did. What that entailed had been set out by Humboldt. For me, the most chilling line in Buck Morse's book, repeated from her article, is the following: In perhaps the most political expression of his career, he used the sensational events of Haiti as the linchpin in his argument in the phenomenology of spirit. To be used as a linchpin, not to be taken up, but to be used. Is it possible for us to distinguish between mere usage and uptake? Did Hegel listen? Did Hegel, like Heyrick and like Humboldt, take up and relay to persons with the power to assuage what enslaved abolitionists told him? Or did he merely hear and use what he heard for his own unrelated to abolition purposes? The intellectual home for the research constellation Hegel and Heyrick is the abolitionist front line between gradualism and immediatism. But if Heyrick was right that gradualism betrays no commitment to abolition whatsoever, and that Wilberforce and Hegel were as one, we need to reconceive what we take to be the history of anti-slavery in Britain, the history of anti-slavery among those who have done the most to abolish slavery. At its best, I propose, that is, at its intellectually and morally most cogent and compelling, the British anti-slavery movement was the Birmingham anti-apprenticeship movement. Although the legal status of pridial and non-pridial apprentice laborer was enacted in 1833 and existed between 1834 and 1838, a campaign against any period of time during which people racialized as Black in the British Empire were to become, through forced labor, fit for freedom, began in 1823 with what is usually referred to as immediatism. It ended in 1848, when abolishing apprenticeship was officially deemed by British society to have been a failure, and when apprenticeship became, on the British model, de rigueur for other European empires choosing to abolish their own institutions of colonial enslavement. The Birmingham anti-apprenticeship movement, I propose, lasted 25 years, from October 1823 to spring 1848. It began with Elizabeth Heyrick's listening to enslaved abolitionists in Demerara. It gained momentum when Joseph Sturge listened to the white women's movement headquartered in Birmingham that Heyrick had mobilized. And it ended with French abolitionists failing to listen to Sturge's advice, handed down to him by Heyrick, who got it originally from enslaved abolitionists in Demerara. If our supposition was right, that Hegel read the letter of June 1824, then unlike Sturge, and like the French abolitionists, Hegel failed to listen to Heyrick. As Professor Bernasconi earlier said, by 1823, abolition wasn't a question of if, but a question of when. Abolish slavery now or abolish slavery later? Later meant a long apprenticeship. If we in this workshop agree to recognize the equivalence of immediatism and anti-apprenticeship, if we agree that the campaign for immediate abolition of colonial slavery just was the campaign against any apprenticeship for people racialized as Black to learn how to be free, how might our reframing of our workshop as Hegel apprenticeship and abolition encourage each of us to revisit and review what we have chosen today to say? Thank you.